Okay, then let's start. So I recognize that you are still all on board, so that's nice to see. And we are moving to the last lecture to link the asymmetric monetary policy paths, with which we began with, now to the current situation of political polarization. Yeah? And Pablo has elaborated on the redistribution effects, and I will link the growth effects of asymmetric monetary policies with political polarization and redistribution effects of monetary policy. So that's the main goal of this last lecture, and that also defines the content. We will shortly discuss the issues of deflation, because deflation or potential deflation is a main argument in favor of the Keynesian rescue policies. We will bring this in contact with the notion of credit crunch. Yeah, so we discussed in lecture number 1 credit growth. Yeah, and credit growth is usually assumed to be positive credit growth, but it will credit growth can also be negative, and then it would be credit crunch. We will see that you can understand the strong extension of central bank balance sheet as a quasi-nationalization of the financial system. And if you nationalize the financial system, you would also nationalize indirectly the enterprise sector, and this would have negative growth effects, in specific on productivity. And if you are an economist, you know that the increases of real wages are based on the increases of productivity. If you have no productivity increases, you can also not increase the real wage level. And if you cannot increase the real wage level, you would have redistribution effects as soon as some social groups gain from the monetary policy interventions, for instance, financial market agents. And that brings us to the redistribution effects, which partially has been already discussed by Pablo, but I will try to give you a broader picture of the redistribution effects of monetary policies. And you will see that many issues being claimed to be bad in our societies can be linked to the asymmetric monetary policy paths. Many people argue that monetary policy is not so important, yeah, because it's only one policy tool besides many other policy tools and many other developments in the society. But keep in mind the size of the tool which is available to the central bankers is very, very large. Yeah? So Mr. Draghi has bought since 2010 bonds equivalent to 2,600 billion euros. Yeah, and the budget of the federal government of Germany per year is 550 billion euros. Yeah. And you see the dimension of the policy intervention. So we will talk about zombies. Yeah, there's an important scientific paper establishing the issue of zombie banks and zombie enterprises, here being published in the American Economic Review. So this is not a small, unimportant academic journal. And the zombie discussion starts again with Japan, because Japan in a way is front-running the United States and Europe. Yeah? And therefore, to understand what will happen in Europe, it's very useful to study the development in Japan. So this is mainly a summary to what I discussed before. During the boom, yeah, there is often a fiscal honeymoon. I call it fiscal honeymoon. Currently, Angela Merkel is in the fiscal honeymoon, because when the cheap money drives the asset price bubble, for instance, in the real estate sector, but also in the stock markets, the tax revenues are inflated. Yeah. And because the tax revenues are inflated currently, year by year, the tax revenues are inflated in Germany through the real estate and the export bubble. Yeah, and this constitutes a very strong incentive not to stop the bubble for the government, and furthermore, to promise more to the voters. Yeah, nowadays, every week there's one minister of the German government which is promising new presents to the German voters and to the European voters as well. But the problem is, once the bubble bursts, and the bubble bursted, as you know, in Greece, Portugal, Spain, and Ireland in 2007, the government has taken a lot of spending obligations, but all of a sudden the tax revenues collapse. Yeah, and when this was best observed in Greece, it's very hard for the government, which has previously inflated the expenditure, to cut it again. Yeah, because increasing the expenditure is much easier than decreasing the expenditure. I think social expenditure in Greece between 2003 and 2008 increased by 130% during a phase where Greece was growing very fast and GDP per capita was increasing very fast. And if you acknowledge that this was due to a bubble, speculative capital inflows coming in from Germany, mainly based on German savings, if the capital inflows stop, you have to reduce the expenditure just to the point where you started in 2003. And this has turned out to be a very politically burdensome process. Yeah? And why is this so difficult? Because in the recession, now, in the first place, asset prices decline. Yeah, during the boom, via the cheap money, asset prices are inflated, and once the bubble has burst, asset prices tend to fall. And in the first place, the deflation, and deflation means falling price level. Yeah, so inflation means increasing price level, deflation means falling price level. And it's quite common for the asset markets, for instance, for the stock market, or sometimes also for the real estate market, that there are phases of rising asset prices and phases of falling asset prices. Is less common for consumer prices, because consumer prices usually, you know, the ECB has an inflation target of 2%, and therefore the target is that the price level per year is increasing by 2% from year to year. And that also implies that a declining price level is not foreseen, yeah, and is not to be allowed by the central bank. And there's also a theoretical argument for that, which says that falling prices lead to recession. Yeah, and the main argument, that's of course a Keynesian argument, and it says if you can expect that the prices will fall, yeah. For instance, you plan to buy something, a computer or a bicycle or a car, and if you now know that the prices will fall, you will postpone the purchase of a respective good to the next year, yeah, and therefore consumption will fall. Yeah, you still can make your own assessment if you plan to buy a computer, and you can expect that the price of computer will fall by 2% within the next year if this affects your purchasing decision. But the theoretical argument is that deflation is equivalent to recession. Yeah? That is often an argument made by central bankers like Bernanke and Mario Draghi, and therefore they are very keen to prevent deflation. And this is a very important justification for inflating money supply in the face of an asset price bubble. But of course, there's also a counter argument, which I will show or explain right away, concerning asset price bubbles. Of course, if you take debt, yeah, in order to finance the purchase of a house, yeah, the real value of a house is strongly influenced by the price level of a real estate. Yeah, and of course, if you have a certain level of debt, and if you divide it, deflate it by the price level of the housing, if the house prices rise, the debt level in real terms measured in the house prices is declining. Yeah, and when people can feel richer and consume more, this is what mainly happened during the subprime boom in the United States. But if now the bubble bursts and the house prices fall, the real debt level is increasing. So debt level divided by the house price, and if the house price is falling, of course, the real debt level is increasing, and therefore constitutes a growing burden for the respective household which has bought the house. In specific, if now in the recession maybe also the wage level would fall, and therefore there's a very strong argument that the central banks should intervene against deflation. Yeah, and when it's not clear anymore if they mean consumer price deflation or asset price deflation, we will see later on what the respective redistribution effects are. But as an Austrian economist, I would add one footnote saying that deflation is not necessarily the same like recession. Yeah. And there's a very important case study for this issue, which is the Industrial Revolution. Yeah, in the second half of the 19th century, there was the Industrial Revolution, and you can explain that based on the Fisher equation. Who knows the Fisher equation in this corner and could write it on the whiteboard? M times P. If I don't write it down, I would know that. So this is the money supply times the velocity of money is equivalent to the output. So these are all goods and services produced in the economy times the price level. Yeah, and that is a basic equation in economics, which is empirically not really challenged. So the velocity of money is the velocity by which the money is circulating. Yeah? If you keep it long in the pockets, the velocity of money would be slow, and if people spend it fast, every euro, the velocity of money would be higher. You can assume it to be constant for simplicity, and this is the money being issued by the central bank. And if you have constant GDP, then the quantity equation would say if the money supply is growing more than the GDP, you would have inflation. Yeah, that's the equation. And now in the time of the Industrial Revolution, the gold standard prevailed. And the gold standard means that all money being issued had to be covered by gold. Yeah. And because gold supply is very scarce, the central banks could not really expand the money supply. Today they have paper money, and therefore the central banks can print the money like they want to, but by then they couldn't because the whole money supply had to be covered by gold, so the money supply was fixed as well. Yeah? And at the same time, because of the Industrial Revolution, output was growing very fast. Yeah. Change a lot of innovation, steam engine, electricity, and so on, and that boosted the output very fast. And then the implication was that the price level would fall, yeah, because the money supply was fixed, and the price level would fall. And by then, we had a period of fast growth and a falling price level, yeah. And this is a kind of historical experiment where you can show that growth, positive growth, and falling price level can come along. Yeah, and it's not really necessarily the case that falling price level is linked to low growth or falling GDP. Yeah, so that is important to know because many central bankers assume that a falling price level is equivalent to a low growth. Yeah, but of course, low growth implies a few inflationary pressure. That's true as well. And here you have the inflation rates of the United States, Japan, and the euro area since the 1980s. You might know that the 1970s here was a period of very high inflation. So it started with the Vietnam War. The United States printed a lot of money in order to finance the Vietnam War. And this war financing via the printing press caused a period of high inflation on a global level. And at the end of the 1970s, a central banker in the United States called Paul Volcker decided to stop the inflation process by strongly increasing the interest rate. And that was very successful. There was a short recession, but only a short recession. And inflation rates came down, and on the back of low inflation, then globally growth recovered. Yeah, and since then you see a few very low inflation rates in most industrialized countries. But at the same time, interest rates converged towards zero, and the balance sheets of the central banks were strongly increased. And that clearly shows, or seems to imply, that the quantity equation does not hold anymore, because a fast increasing money supply combined with sluggish growth and more or less constant GDP did not show up in consumer price inflation. Yeah, but we discussed the day before that if you extend the notion of inflation to asset prices rather than consumer prices, of course, the monetary expansion here being generated by the central banks would lead to inflation, but asset price inflation instead of consumer price inflation. Yeah, but what is observed now is that low inflation more and more comes along with low growth. Yeah, and now the question is, what is the reason? Yeah, and one reason is that's clearly discovered is now originating in Japan. Japan is again front running sluggish credit growth. Yeah, so-called credit crunch. You may remember that on Monday, on Thursday, I showed you the graph on the credit growth in Japan, and since 1998 it comes down to zero, or even is sometimes negative. Yeah, and that's a credit crunch. So the credit provided by the banks to the enterprise sector is shrinking, and it's clearly understood that this credit crunch is associated with low growth, because there's a low demand for credit and low investment and low growth. And now the question is, what is the reason for the credit crunch? And there are several hypotheses for these questions. So the first justification is asset price deflation. Yeah, because the banks in their balance sheets, they have a lot of stocks and real estate. Yeah, and if the stock and real estate prices decline, they realize a loss, and their equity is getting smaller. And if their equity is getting smaller, their scale or scope for extending credit is shrinking as well. Yeah, so that's a kind of a rule or law. If equity is shrinking, the possibility to extend credit is shrinking as well, and therefore the asset price deflation is a very important explanation for the credit crunch, which is now coming along with low growth. Yeah, so that is one justification. And there's also a policy response here proposed by prominent American economists for Japan, Posen and Bernanke, who argue first you have to increase the equity of banks again. So that's recapitalization, and recapitalization means you take taxpayers' money and inject it into the banks, and then the equity would rise, and the rising equity would enable banks again to increase the credit volume and to finance investment. That's one strategy to stabilize the banking sector. And of course, the other one is to cut interest rates, because if you cut interest rates, you push up asset prices again. And by pushing up asset prices again, you would again stabilize banks. Yeah, but Japan is a very good case study. Of course, both happened. A tremendous monetary expansion plus recapitalization of banks in 1998, but growth in Japan does not recover. Yeah, that's the problem. And that's also now observed in the European Union. And then you can look at for different explanatory approaches why the credit volume is shrinking. And you can also come out from the demand side of the credit market. And you can argue that because of the asset price deflation, yeah, also households and enterprises are in trouble. Yeah, households have bought houses as well for high prices. And then now the value of their houses is declining, and you have to adjust to the decline of house prices by curtailing consumption. Yeah, and the enterprises, they have real estate as well, and they are doing the same thing, and therefore you would observe that consumption and investment is declining, And you know, consumption and investment are important components of aggregated demand. And this would then exert a negative growth effect on the economy. And who identified this effect for Japan, he's the chief economist of Nomura Securities, he now recommends that the government steps in. If you reduce consumption and investment as important demand components, the government could consume more. And this is mainly done in Japan, and therefore Japan is substituting private demand by public demand. Yeah, so I will write down the demand components. So output here on the demand side is equivalent to consumption plus investment plus government expenditure plus exports minus imports. Yeah, and what happens now is that consumption is coming down and investment is coming down. And the policy proposition of coup is to increase government expenditure to substitute the declining demand components coming from the household sector and the enterprise sector. Yeah? But of course, the government has a financing problem. How should they finance all the additional expenditures? So now in Japan, a lot of highways are built, first important highways, and then highways into the middle of nowhere. But they have to build highways in order to generate government demand. And of course, they can only finance the public expenditure by issuing bonds, by increasing the debt level from 60% of GDP in 1990 to 240% of GDP nowadays. And the dramatically increasing debt level of Japan would, of course, destabilize Japan, like it happened for Greece, for instance, unless somebody is buying all these bonds. And of course, there's only one institution which would buy all these bonds from a highly indebted government, and that's now the Bank of Japan. Yeah. So in a way, that's a monetization of the public debt. So all the bonds being issued to finance Keynesian demand programs are now bought by the Bank of Japan and end up in the balance sheet of the Bank of Japan. Yeah, and then you see a very strong correlation between credit growth. Yeah, so remember in the first lecture we discussed credit growth, real growth. That's the percent change rate of the Y of the output here on the whiteboard, and the interest rate level. Yeah, so they all seem to be strongly correlated. That's the high growth period of the 1980s, including the bubble. Yeah, you see here the bubble, the credit growth driving the Japanese bubble economy. You see also the bursting of the bubble and the decline of the credit growth. Here, its credit growth is negative. Yeah, that's the credit crunch. So the volume of credit is declining, and you see also the interest rate response. Yeah? This is a short-term interest rate set by the Bank of Japan, which falls during the 1990s to zero and stays mainly at zero until today. And the promise by central bankers is, if we cut interest rates, the financing conditions for investments are going up, but they don't go up. Yeah, so investment does not go up. So the idea is, if you cut interest rates, investment will go up. But here for Japan, it's very evident that investment is not going up. The share of investment continues to decline over a period of 30 years. Less and less and less and less and less investment. And instead of investment, more and more and more and more and more and more government expenditure as a share of GDP. And later on, we will get to the issue of quasi-nationalization. If you substitute private demand by public demand, of course, you nationalize in a way the economy, because private demand components are substituted by public demand components. And in the view of the Keynesian economists, this would generate growth. And in the view of the Austrian economists, this would paralyze growth. And clearly, for Japan, you might observe that you have very low growth. Yeah? Now, meanwhile, 3 lost decades. And the interesting thing for Japan, in order to generate this small growth per year, something around 1%, if the numbers which are compiled by the statistical offices are true, but in order to compile these low growth rates, more and more Japanese have to work. So the Japanese entering the working force more and more increase. Yeah, and this implies that the productivity is declining. Yeah, in specific now, women have to enter the labor market in order to maintain the living standards of the families. And this implies that if you have a more or less constant GDP with a growing labor force, yeah, and productivity is divided as GDP divided by the working people, number of working people, so productivity would decline, productivity increases, and would converge below zero or even under zero. Yeah? And this is a problem, as you see. So we have a quasi-nationalization of the Japanese economy, the first now showing up in the financial sector. Why in the financial sector? Because during the crisis, you have collapsing financial institutions, and there's only one solution in response to collapsing financial institutions, because this has a lot of contagion effects. If one big financial institution is collapsing, others would collapse as well, and they stop providing credit to the enterprise, you would have a big crisis, so you have to nationalize them. Yeah, and the big financial crisis in Japan does not occur in 1990, when the Japanese bubble burst. It occurs in 1998 with the Japanese financial crisis, because you know that in the first place, the low interest rate set by the Bank of Japan enabled in the first half of the 1990s the Japanese bank to bring cheap money to Southeast Asia, to finance investment there. And only with the Asian crisis, now a lot of Japanese banks collapse, yeah, because they have taken a new risky exposure which shows up. And by then, many financial institutions in Japan are nationalized. By the way, also in Europe since 2008, many financial institutions have been nationalized, including, for instance, Commerzbank. Yeah. Then, if you want to prevent collapsing financial institutions, you can ask bigger institutions to take them over. Yeah. So here, for instance, in 2008, we had Sächsische Landesbank. Yeah. In Sächsische Landesbank, we had to take a lot of risk in US subprime market, and it collapsed. Yeah. And because this was a big problem for the Saxonian government, Landesbank of Baden-Württemberg was asked to take over Sächsische Landesbank. Yeah, when the problem was resolved from a political point of view, but now the old problems are with Landesbank Baden-Württemberg. Yeah, and then the returns of the taking over institution would decline. So this is so-called convoy approach. Collapsing smaller institutions are taken over by larger institutions, and this brings the larger institutions into trouble. Yeah, so nowadays Commerzbank is in trouble, as you know, and one important reason is that during the financial crisis, Commerzbank had taken over Dresdner Bank. Yeah, and now they have all the bad assets in their books, and they cannot recover. And this also happened in Japan. So, and what will the banks do? Now they have a lot of risk, yeah, and to reduce the risk, they reduce the credit to the private sector, yeah, because the credit to the private sector is regarded to be very risky, and it's better to buy instead government bonds, yeah, and in the balance sheets now of the Japanese banks, they try to reduce the credit to the private sector, and instead they buy government bonds, and that's a very good idea because of the growing government expenditure and the growing government debt. Also the supply of government bonds is increasing. So in the structure of the balance sheet of the Japanese banks, credit to the private sector is also substituted by credit to the public sector. So now they hold the government bonds of the highly indebted government, And this implies that because they have a lot of risky assets in their balance sheet, if you would increase the interest rates, a lot of enterprises would be in trouble, a lot of households would be in trouble, the government would be in trouble, and this implies that the financial sector can only survive if a central bank keeps the interest rate at 0. Yeah, and here the notion of zombie banks is created. So the Japanese banks can only survive if the central bank keeps the interest rate at 0, injecting liquidity directly or indirectly to the financial sector at very low cost. Yeah, and once you have zombie banks, you would also have zombie enterprises, because as now the recession continues in Japan, also many Japanese enterprises get into economic trouble, and they have taken credit from the banks. Yeah, and if they would default, if the enterprises would default, the shaky Japanese banks would be in trouble, and you would have a financial crisis as well. And therefore, you have to prevent that the small and medium enterprises, and specifically the small and medium enterprises in Japan, collapse. Yeah, and they would collapse if you would withdraw credit, because their balance sheets as well are not very solid, and so on. And this implies that now the banks are forced to continue to provide credit to a lot of low profit or negative profit enterprises. Yeah? And then the zombie banks come along with the zombie enterprises. Yeah? So there's talk about forbearance lending. So usually if you provide credit to the enterprise, you only provide credit to the enterprises if the enterprise is solid. Yeah? And if not solid, you have to withdraw the credit, and the enterprise has to be restructured to become profitable again. But now the Japanese banks are very much afraid from withdrawing credit from the enterprises, and continue to provide credit to a lot of enterprises which are not solid anymore. Yeah, so-called zombie enterprises, which are now evergreening. Whatever happens, the enterprises can survive because they continue to rely on the forbearance lending from the Japanese banks. And now here's a very important sentence, which says that zero interest rate policy becomes equivalent to soft budget constraints. And soft budget constraints is a notion being here created by János Kornai for Hungary and the socialist planning economies in Central and Eastern Europe. And usually you have a hard budget constraint. For instance, I have a hard budget constraint. I have a specific salary, maybe 600 euros per month, and the salary is fixed. Yeah, even if I spend more, I cannot ask my employer, University of Leipzig, to send me more. Yeah, if I spend more than 600 euros, more than my salary, and it's not enough to feed my family, I could ring on the door of the president of University of Leipzig and say, I need more, but she would respond, no, it's only 600. That's the contract. Yeah, even it's the same for you as a student. So students, if they get a certain budget every month from their parents, yeah, this is limited to this amount. And even if you spend more, the parents would argue, I don't have more. But maybe some of you are spoiled by the parents. They have a soft budget constraint. Yeah, if you have a budget of 400 or 600 and you spend 700 because you lost money in the casino of Leipzig, you can ring to your father and tell him, send me more. Yeah, and then you have a soft budget constraint. Who of you has a hard budget constraint? Who of you has a soft budget constraint? Ah, that's good to know. You are Italian, right? Partly Italian? Right. Okay, so Italy has a soft budget constraint.
It's the half German part.
So in the communist planning economy, there were soft budget constraints because there were a lot of unprofitable enterprises. Yeah. So when the wall came down, this was very evident. And the government didn't want these enterprises to collapse. Yeah, because if these enterprises would have collapsed, there would have been an unemployment, big unemployment, a lot of unemployed people, and unemployed people were not in line with the dogma of socialist economy, because in socialism, per definition, there was no unemployment. Yeah, and therefore the enterprises could not collapse, and therefore the enterprises, if they had not sufficient means to maintain their production, they could ask for more credit from the state-owned banks. Yeah, and the banks, they are state-owned, and therefore they serve in the interest of the state. Yeah, and if enterprises needs more funding, they provide more funding. And this was, of course, an economic problem for state-owned banks, and therefore the means of the state-owned banks were not sufficient, but they could ask from the central bank for financing, and the financing was provided by the central bank, and the money was printed with a printing press. Yeah, these were the soft budget constraints of socialist planning economies, and there was one big downside. There was never a restructuring of the enterprises, and this meant there was no technological change, because there was no need to increase efficiency. So when the wall came down here between Western and Eastern Germany, you could compare the technological level of cars, for instance. Yeah, so the technological level of cars was much higher in Western Germany than in Eastern Germany. So Trabi was cute, but very small and out of plastic and loud and bad smelling and so on. So there's a different level in technological change, and the productivity level was very low. Yeah, because there were a lot of unemployed, quasi-unemployed people sticking in the enterprises, which were financed by the central bank. Yeah, and usually, if you finance government expenditure via the central bank, inflation would go up. Yeah, prices would go up. But prices could not go up in the planning economies because prices were controlled. Yeah, so the government just decided about the price. Yeah, but where did the inflation show up? When? So the people had a lot of money in the pockets, and prices were low, very low. Yeah.
That means that they consume more than they otherwise would have.
But could they consume more?
There will be shortages.
Yes, there are shortages. Yeah. So they want to consume more because they have a lot of money in the pocket, but there are shortages. You have line up in front of a store, and you do not get what you want. Yeah. So that was a form of inflation in the socialist planning economies. It was not price inflation; it was hidden inflation in form of shortages. And remember what we discussed on Thursday. Of course, we have low inflation here now in the industrialized countries, but inflation is showing up outside the index, the official index. So it's hidden in a way as well. Yeah. So the idea is now that we are more and more converging towards the economic patterns of the planning economies. We have soft budget constraints for the enterprises. So Japan is a very important example. Nowadays, Southern Europe is a very important example as well. Italy, Spain, Greece, Portugal, and so on. You have need for restructuring, but the Italian enterprises, the Italian banks don't restructure because there's unlimited liquidity injection via the European Central Bank. Yeah, so the target balances. So since 2008, I think 600 billion euros went to Italy. Yeah, and that's quite a large amount. And then the cleansing effect we talked about yesterday wouldn't take place. Yeah, so you have distorted economic structures. For instance, during the boom, yeah, a lot of resources are shifted to the real estate sector, and in the Hayekian theory, when interest rates are kept relatively high, this overinvestment or this malinvestment has to be dismantled, but now it's not dismantled. Yeah, and that means a lot of investment with low or negative productivity is preserved. Yeah, and if you imagine that the aggregated productivity level of an economy is a function of all single productivities of all single enterprises, of course now the average productivity level would decline. Yeah, and you would observe that the productivity levels are declining. Yeah, and now you can ask why this is the case. Yeah, or why this is so bad. Yeah, because productivity is something abstract. Yeah, so it's output, the Y here, divided by the number of working people. Yeah, and productivity is very crucial for the welfare of people. Why?
It's the main source for wage increases.
It's the main source for wage increases. Yeah. So if you compare, for instance, India with Germany, yeah. So in India, the productivity level is low. Output per person is low, and because output per worker is low, the wage level is low, and in specific, the social welfare systems are not developed at all. Yeah, and in the European countries, we have a very high productivity level, and because we have a very high productivity level, we have a very high wage level, and we have a very developed social security system. Yeah, so social welfare does not fall from heaven; it has to be financed. Yeah, and in the industrialized countries in Europe, we have very generous social security systems. Yeah, also we are rich. We are rich and we have very generous social security systems. In India, the people are poor and we have no social security systems at all. Yeah. So in order to have social security systems, you need a high productivity level. Otherwise, it's not financeable. Yeah.
Becomes even more important in case of Japan, where there's a strong demographic change and shrinking workforces and even more retirement benefits and social benefits are not.
Yeah, that's an issue. Of course, the Japanese social security systems are more efficient than the European social security systems. But indeed, a very large share of the growing government expenditure went into subsidies for the pension schemes. Yeah, because we have an aging society. The GDP is constant or maybe shrinking. Yeah, so the problem, the issue is that output per person, yeah, per worker, labor, yeah, this is productivity. Yeah. So now Japan has much more people working, yeah, at more or less the same output, yeah, and that implies shrinking productivity, yeah? And that's the problem. So more and more, in specific, a lot of Japanese women now have to enter the labor market, yeah, and they enter the labor market at a low wage level, yeah, and this is a loss of welfare, in my view, because the same GDP is generated by more working people, yeah. If we generate the same GDP with less working people, we have a high productivity, and this is a welfare gain. Yeah? Also, it's nice that women work, but this is a negative productivity. Yeah? And that's a problem for the country, because a lot of things you could have financed before, you cannot finance it anymore. Yeah? And now for mainstream economics, there's a big problem. Yeah, a big puzzle. Yeah, we now observe that productivity gains are converging towards zero. Yeah, and I tell you how productivity is calculated. Where all the goods which are produced are calculated, yeah, in nominal terms, and it's easy to add it up in nominal terms. But productivity levels are based on real variables. Yeah. And so you have to deflate it. Yeah. Goods and services in euros divided by the price level. Yeah. That's real growth. Yeah. And then to calculate growth, it's very crucial what kind of price level you use. Yeah? And what kind of concept of measuring the price level you use. Yeah? And if you systematically calculate down the price level in order to hide inflation, you would also bias upwards the growth rates. Yeah? If you would acknowledge that we have higher inflation when it's officially measured, the real growth rates would be much lower, or they would be even negative. Yeah? And of course, if in Tagesschau a growth rate of -1% instead of 1% would be reported, yeah, that would have a totally different impact on the public discussion about the success of public economic policy making. Yeah, as long as in Tagesschau positive growth is reported, everything seems to be fine, and the government can claim that Germany has never been richer. Yeah, but if they report negative growth rates, this hypothesis is not true anymore, because Germany has been richer last year compared to this year. Yeah, and then the question would arise, where is our welfare going? Yeah, but even the official numbers now show that the productivity growth rates are converging towards zero. And real wage increases are based on productivity increases. If productivity is increasing, the real wage level can increase. If productivity is not increasing, the average real wage level cannot increase. And now let's assume the official numbers. I don't really believe in the official numbers anymore, but they are close to zero. Yeah? And mainstream economics does not understand why now productivity gains are converging towards zero, but this means that more or less, in average, the wage levels cannot increase anymore. Yeah, and now you can walk through the city. Sometimes you see posters from physicians, yeah, telling you they do a very good job and they want to have higher wages. Yeah, or you drive through the countryside, there's farmers, yeah, they want more money for their milk, yeah, which is equivalent to a increasing wage level. Or you read in the newspaper that again the returns or the payments to the investment bankers have increased in average by 100,000 euros per year or so on. Yeah, there are still some social groups which have income increases. I think also politicians regularly they increase their salaries. Yeah, but if you have a zero productivity gain and some social groups increase their wage level, necessarily another social group has to have a lower wage level. Yeah, and that brings you now to the redistribution effects of monetary policy. Yeah, and there are tremendous redistribution effects of monetary policy. So I collected, there are more and it's more complicated, but I collected now seven redistribution effects of monetary policy, and that's maybe the last step we have to go. So the first redistribution effect is from the private to the public sector. So why from the private to the public sector? That's very easy. That's financial repression. So the public sector has high debt. Yeah, high debt levels. Japan 240% of GDP, Greece 170% of GDP, Italy 140% of GDP, United States 100% of GDP. So they have a high debt level. Yeah, and they couldn't pay the interest on the debt if the central banks would not buy the bonds and depress the interest rate towards zero. Yeah, and that's financial repression. Yeah, so maybe Italy would have to pay an interest rate of 13% given its debt level. So Italy would be more or less bankrupt, but the ECB is buying a lot of government bonds. So the interest rate level on Italian government bonds is 3%. Yeah, not so much different from German. Yeah, also the debt level is very different. Yeah, Germany 60%, Italy 140, 30. Yeah, and in Japan 240% of GDP. The interest rate level of for 10-year government bonds in Japan. Who knows? Zero. Yeah. So the central bank has a target of 0 for interest rate on Japanese government bonds. Although the debt level is 240% of GDP, much higher in Greece, for instance. Yeah. So this is a redistribution from the private sector to the public sector, because on the other side of the bond market, somebody is holding these bonds. Yeah. That can be banks, that can be pension schemes, that can be foundations, that can be private people, whatever. A lot of private institutions are holding these government bonds, and the interest rate on these government bonds is pushed towards 0. Yeah. So this is a redistribution from the private sector to the public sector. That's redistribution number 1, and these are very, very large volumes. Yeah. I think there's a calculation for Germany, which has comparatively low public debt, that they the German government saved about 380 billion euros through the ECB monetary policy since 2010 or so. Yeah, so that's additional income for the German government because they don't have to pay interest on their bonds. Now we have a redistribution from the enterprise sector to the financial sector, and this is due to the fact that the asset prices are strongly increasing, and obviously the prices of goods and services are not increasing. Yeah, and so if you trade in the financial markets, you can make profit from the sharply increasing asset prices. Yeah, if you know that the ECB will start to buy government bonds and push down the interest rate, and if you know that this has a positive on the stock market, you can front run the ECB and buy stocks. Yeah, and you can make a lot of profits. Of course, the housewife in Swabia is not able to make this projection, but the investment bankers in London are able to do that. Yeah, so they are much smarter than Swabian housewives or students in Leipzig and so on. So can make a lot of profit if they are able to project the monetary policy response patterns of the central banks. Yeah, and the enterprises, can they increase the prices? They cannot increase the prices because the prices hardly increase for reasons which we will discuss right away. But the price increase potential in the enterprise sector for goods and services are very small. Yeah, so much bigger profit opportunities for the financial institutions compared to the enterprises. Yeah, and we also discussed yesterday that the newly issued money is going through the financial sector, and the financial sector linked to the Cantillon effect can make profit from that. Yeah. So the financial sector is gaining. Then there's a redistribution from poor to rich. So why from poor to rich? Because the ECB is driving up asset prices, and the Bank of Japan is driving up asset prices, and the Federal Reserve Bank are driving asset prices. And who has real estate in the big city, and who owns stocks? Yeah. This is mostly rich people. Yeah, and students don't own real estate. Who owns real estate? Nobody. No. So who owns stocks? 2, 3 at least. Yeah, but maybe only small packages. Yeah. So the big stock packages are owned by the rich people. So now they get much richer because the central banks inflate the asset prices. Yeah. And the middle class in specific German middle class, they mostly save via bank deposits, in specific in Germany, because in Germany inflation was always low, so it was safe to put the money into the banks. So Germans are used to save in form of bank deposits, and now the interest rates on the bank deposits are depressed to zero, yeah. And if the inflation rate, however you measure it, is between 1 and 5%, in real terms, it would be a negative real return on bank deposits. Yeah, so that's a redistribution from the middle class to the rich people. Rich people gain and the middle class is losing. Then you have a redistribution from young people to old people. So why? Why from young people to old people? So you are young, but you are not aware of it.
I think old people have more negotiation power in their contracts than young people.
And why?
Because they're in these old contracts.
Mm-hmm. They have made their contracts when the economies were still growing. Yeah, so they have got good contracts. So now you talk about the labor market, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Sure. And what about young people?
Young people will be subject to this inflationary policy for much longer, which will depreciate their savings.
If they have savings, yes. But how do they negotiate their contracts? They get new contracts if they enter the labor market, right? And if we are now in a situation where the economy is on decline, the contract is much worse than 10 years or 20 years or 30 years before. Yeah. So the contracts which are made now, today, for people entering the labor market, they are much worse than for people entering the labor market 20 or 30 or 40 years ago. Yeah. So I sometimes, if I know what happened decades before, I'm asking my mother, yeah, and I ask her, how many salaries did you get in the 1970s? And she said 17. Yeah. Normally nowadays you assume that you get 12 salaries, but in this high growth period in Germany, she got 17 salaries. Yeah. Of course, nowadays you get 12. Yeah.
Isn't there also an effect working in the opposite direction if you assume that young people are tendentially creditors and the old people are debtors?
Okay.
Young people are debtors.
So if you are, so young people are debtors?
They take the debt.
They take the debt.
They are debtors in the old.
Okay, and you mean they profit from low interest rate?
In some sense.
Because they take the debt? That's a very simple model, because you need, in order to take debt, you need more. So would you get a debt contract?
Well, in order to take out a loan from a bank, you need a stable stream of income, or you need assets that can serve as collateral in the debt contract. So there are, again, people who already possess assets and who earn a relatively high income are benefited disproportionately, because they are able to take a disproportionate amount of the newly created money out of the banking system.
Yeah, you need collateral. And there are two types of collateral. First, you have an asset. You have already real estate or stocks. Yeah, so you don't have real estate to use it as a collateral, or you have a stable long-term contract, well paid. Yeah, but now the salaries for the young peoples are declining, and in specific, the duration of contract is shortening. Yeah, if you enter the labor market nowadays as a young person, usually you have a limited contract, only for 1 year, 2 years, and you have to wait very long in order to get an unlimited contract. Yeah, for instance, in the in journalism in Germany nowadays, until to get a unlimited contract, you have to be 50 or 55. Yeah, earlier it's merely not possible. Yeah. So it's very difficult to take debt if you don't have collateral and if you don't have a stable contract, long-term contract. Yeah? So the young people, they lose because of nominal wage repression, yeah? And because of increasing real estate prices. Because if nowadays you want to buy a house for your family, because you don't own a house yet, and real estate prices have gone up, the real estate price in terms of your salary have dramatically increased. Yeah. So again, I can ask my mother. She bought a house, built a house in the 1960s. And she tells me she worked in the beer garden in order to buy her first piece of land to build the house. Yeah. So in her 20s, of course, by when my both parents were working, this was uncommon. But in their 20s, with 24 or so, they bought a piece of land. They built a house. They filled the house with furniture, and we had 2 kids and a car. Yeah, that's about your age. Who is able to do that? Yeah, but you don't understand because you are not able to compare. Yeah. Okay, then from small to large enterprises and from small to large financial institutions. And this is linked to the structure of the capital market. Yeah? So usually, if you finance as an enterprise, you have 2 ways to do that. The first way is to issue bonds on the capital market. Yeah? But this is very expensive, and therefore only large enterprises can do that. For instance, Bayer or Siemens or Mercedes or so on, they can issue bonds to do financing. The small and medium enterprises, they are relying on their banks, yeah, usually on small and medium banks, on Sparkasse or Volksbank and so on. And now on the large capital markets, the interest rate level is mainly 0. Yeah, and it's 0 because the government bonds and the enterprise bonds are close substitutes. And if the central banks buy a large amount of government bonds and also enterprise bonds, they mainly depress the interest rate level to 0. And therefore nowadays for big enterprises, the financing costs at the capital markets are mainly 0. Yeah? And in former times, external capital was a very important cost position for large enterprises, but this cost position has mainly disappeared. Yeah, so they save a lot of costs because their financing costs have been depressed to 0. For the small and medium enterprises, financing costs have declined as well, but they have to rely on the banks, on the small and medium banks, and the small and medium banks are now in trouble. And they are in trouble because the ECB is cutting the interest rate level step by step, or other large center banks. And traditionally, the small and medium banks, they took in deposits, yeah, from the Swabians and paid the interest on the deposits, and they lended out these deposits to the enterprises. And the spread was 3% more or less. Yeah, and now the central banks depress the interest rate, and they also depress the spread. Yeah. So nowadays in Japan, from 3.5 to 0.5, the spread. Yeah. So the traditional source of income for small and medium banks is taken away. So they are in financial trouble. So they have to close down all their retail and so on, and they have to fire people. And of course, their scope to provide cheap credit to the small and medium enterprises is not as large as the very favorable financing conditions on the large capital markets would suggest. Yeah, and therefore there's a redistribution for large enterprise in favor of large enterprises and at the cost of the small and medium enterprises, and therefore the small and medium enterprises would tend to shrink, and the small and medium banks would tend to shrink as well, and the big enterprises and the big financial institutions are growing. Yeah, and the big financial institutions, they can do investment bankings, they can enter the markets where the bubbles build up very easily and make large profits. So you would observe a concentration process both in the enterprise sector and in the financial markets. So the small entities have a sluggish development and the big entities are thriving. And now you have regions where you have only small and medium enterprises, and you have regions where big enterprises are clustered. Yeah. For instance, here in Eastern Germany, there's only one stock-listed enterprise. Yeah. Everything else are small and medium enterprises in Eastern Germany. In Southern Germany, you have a lot of stock-listed enterprises. In Frankfurt, you have a lot of financial institutions, big financial institutions. And this implies that the regions with the big economic entities, in Japan it's Tokyo, would grow or still remain very active in economic activity. And the other regions with only small and medium enterprises would shrink. So they would have no power to pay high salaries. And then the young people will migrate from the regions with weak economic activity to the regions with large enterprises. Yeah, and then Eastern Germany would shrink and Southern Germany would grow and grow and grow. Yeah, and that's everywhere observable in Japan. Tokyo is buoyant, and the periphery of Japan is shrinking, and the young people are moving to Tokyo and so on. And finally, that's an issue we didn't discuss in detail. Countries with current account surpluses. A current account surplus is always backed by respective capital exports. So if Germany exports capital, for instance, to Southern European countries, the Southern European countries can buy German goods, and that would generate the export surplus of Germany. But at the end, if this is beneficial, this is of course beneficial for the German export enterprises. But if this is beneficial for the German citizens, depends if a credit is repaid or not repaid. And very often it's not repaid because during financial crises, these assets are destroyed. Yeah. So the Germans had a lot of exposure in the US subprime market. It's not clear how much, maybe 600 billion euros. And when the subprime crisis hits, this is away. Yeah. And the burden has to be somehow shifted to the German citizens, for instance, by depressing the wage level. Okay, that are the redistribution effects, and the last is in pictures. So this is the financial repression. These are the interest rates on government bonds and the deposit rates in banks. That's the average for Japan, Euro area, United States, and England, United Kingdom. Yeah, and you see that a 10-year government bond in the early 1980s had a 10% yield in average, and now the average yield is 1%. Yeah, and the same is true for the bank deposits. Yeah, so the bank deposit earns quite a fair interest rate in the 1980s, and now the average interest rate on bank deposit is very low, usually between 0 and 1%. Yeah, and it depends on which side you are. If you are a debtor, it's good, and debtors are mainly the governments and partially the enterprises. But if you are a creditor, the saver, is very bad for you. Yeah, and these are nominal terms. If you subtract inflation, however you measure inflation, and do not necessarily believe in the public numbers close to inflation rates. Yeah. So here now, if the official, this is 1%, if the average inflation rate is 1 plus 1.7, then you have a negative return of 0.7. But if realized inflation beyond official measures is 3%, you have a negative yield of -2. Yeah? It depends very strongly the real return on official inflation measurement. Then you have the wage growth in the US manufacturing and financial sector. This is also a very interesting slide. This is the United States, and of course, if the number is positive, you have a growing wage. If the number is negative, you have a falling wage level. You see that always in the recession, the wage level is falling. But you also see a kind of structural change in the 1990s in the relationship of the two. Yeah. So up to the 1980s, the wage increase in the manufacturing sector on average was higher than the wage increase in the financial sector. Yeah. And this turns around in the 1980s. Since the 1980s, you have always a higher wage increase in the financial sector compared with the manufacturing sector. And even in financial crises, yeah, so this is a subprime crisis, the wage is falling in the manufacturing sector and it's not falling in the financial sector. And of course, if a lot of public money is injected in the financial sector, this helps to maintain the wage level in the financial sector, but in the manufacturing sector, due to the crisis, the wage level has declined. Yeah? So you have a relative increase of the wage level of the financial sector, which is close to the money of the central banks compared to the manufacturing sector. When the asset inequality, so the black line here, the black line are the Piketty data. Yeah, so Piketty complained about increasing inequality, yeah, and he attributes increasing inequality to market forces. So I agree that inequality is increasing, but I don't agree with the explanation because Piketty attributes this to the market forces, to market failure. I would attribute it to government failure to the central banks. So here in the mid-1980s, the share of the top 1% out of total income was about 10%. Yes, top 1% incomes took 10% of all incomes. Yeah, and this increases now to more than 20%. Yeah, so maybe 22%, more than double. Yeah, so you have indeed substantially increasing income inequality in the United States, and now we match this with the asset prices. So this is the stock price in the United States, this is the stock price in Japan, and you know stock markets are always interlinked, but somehow it seems that the very rich people can translate stock price increases or inflated asset prices into rising incomes, however they do that. Yeah? But they can make more profit from the rising asset prices compared to the normal people. Now the wage repression. Yeah, so this is Japan. Yeah? Again, and this is calculated based on the official inflation numbers. And as I said, the big financial crisis is in 1998. Yeah, and you can nicely see that since 1998, the average wage level in Japan is declining. Yeah, so here the declining wage level, even in the official numbers, is very obvious. Yeah, and it's very clear that the major burden is taken by the new entrants into the labor market, which is mainly young people and women entering the labor market having not worked before. Yeah, and very often to maintain the living standard of the parents. Yeah, in former times only one person worked, the husband mostly, but sometimes also the wife. So nowadays, in order to maintain the living standard, both have to work, and that brings us the first time also to the issue of family planning. Yeah, if both people work, yeah, husband and wife, family planning gets more difficult. Yeah, so you might also postpone family planning. And this is the data for the United States. So the median weekly income by age groups, we have 4 age groups, 15 to 24, 25 to 34, 45 to 54 and 55 to 64. And we see how the real wage, so this is deflated by the consumer prices, how the real wage changed since the early 1980s. Yeah, and you have clearly falling wages for the young people, so the people which are in this age group. Yeah, in this year. So these are the people who are in the year 2007 in the age group between 15 and 24. Yeah, and you clearly see for the young people a declining wage level, but still an increasing wage level for the elder people. And maybe also the type of employment contract is changing. Yeah, so when I studied the Japanese economy, Japan was a country of lifetime employment. Yeah, and a lifetime employment meant that everybody entering the labor market got a lifetime contract. Yeah, and everybody is not true. It was in 1984, 85% in Japan had a lifetime contract. Yeah, and you see that now over the time, the share of lifetime contracts is substantially increasing, or the share of non-regular employment forms is substantially increasing. Yeah, so it becomes more and more common to provide short-term contracts because the future economic situation is uncertain. Yeah. So in the 1950s, 1960s, 1970s, Japan was growing. Yeah. And if the economy is growing, it's very rational for an enterprise to get a close relationship with the employed person, with the workers. Yeah, because you need a lot of labor force, so you have to bind the labor force to your enterprise. If you expect economic decline or declining market, you would not take this commitment, but you have to always be prepared for the next crisis, and you would hesitate to make a long-term contract. Yeah? So the same takes place in the German university sector. When I was a research assistant, I got a full employment with an unlimited contract or quite long contract. Nowadays, all research assistants get a half employment for quite short contracts. So this has fundamentally changed. Like in Japan, so here you see the concentration process in the Japanese banking sector. So Taiki collected these numbers. So these are large banks, like Commerzbank and Deutsche Bank, the city banks. These are the regional banks, maybe comparable with Sparkassen. And these are the shrinking banks, maybe comparable with Genossenschaftsbank and Volksbank and Raiffeisenbank. And you see that for all of them, the number is shrinking. So you have a very strong concentration process in the Japanese banking sector. And the economic concentration is very easy to measure for Japan, because in Japan, in a very evident way, economic activity is mainly clustered in Tokyo and neighboring prefectures. Yeah, and what we did here is to build a relationship between Tokyo and the 6 neighboring prefectures and the rest of the country. Yeah, and if the line is falling, yeah, the rest of the country would shrink relative to Tokyo and its neighboring prefectures, and you clearly see the periphery shrinking. Yeah, in Tokyo, where the big enterprises are clustered, is comparatively robust economically. Yeah, so you have a regional concentration of economic activity, which is now can have also other reasons, not only monetary policy, but certainly monetary policy will enforce this trend. Yeah, and now the question is, what is the impact on the political landscape? A shrinking environment. So in my idea, if you change the economic system from a market economy to a planning economy, where GDP will shrink, And if a GDP shrinks, you have less to distribute to the citizens.
And it turns a rather decentralized economy to a more centralized economy, which is easier to control and regulate by government.
That's a nice idea. You think you have more concentration of economic activity? That's true. Yeah, if you have only few enterprises, it's a very Hayekian argument. Yeah. So Hayek wanted distributed economic power. Many small enterprises, because many small enterprises are very difficult to political control. Yeah. In Nazi Germany, the economy was dominated by a few very big enterprises. Yeah. So the economy was very easy to control by the totalitarian government. Yeah. And therefore, after World War II, in Germany was a very strong concern to resolve economic power and to create an economic environment with a lot of small and medium enterprises instead of very few large enterprises. Yeah. So it's easier to be controlled politically, right? And of course, large entities are less efficient than small enterprises. Many small enterprises, because there's less competition. Okay, what else?
They might even become more fragile as there's a given risk distributed across less entities.
Right.
Which are more interconnected.
There's less resilience and more contagion, because few enterprises are more interconnected than many small enterprises. Yes.
Political polarization, because the periphery gets less from wealth.
Right, so the periphery gets less from the center. Yeah, that's clear here for Eastern Germany. So people are the level of income is much lower than in the western part of Germany. Yeah, it's good to go to the hairdresser at the end of the month because nobody will be there because we have no money anymore. We have to wait until the new money is coming in. So people might regard this as unfair.
If enterprises get clustered, or like only big enterprises, let's say, have big economic power, they also have a larger, let's say, lobbying possibility against the government,
right?
Which spikes again, for example, inequality or redistribution problem.
Right, that's certainly the issue for the German export surplus. So I'm convinced that we are giving the savings of our citizens away in order to finance our export surplus. That does not make sense from the perspective of German citizens, but it makes sense from the German export industry. Yeah, and they can lobby with the politicians that action is taken, that this will not change. Yeah. So anyway, however the redistribution effects are, you have a lot of losers. Yeah, the economy is shrinking. Some parts of the population can lobby to gain, and many people lose. However, yeah. So some are frustrated, and if they are frustrated, they might lift the hand and complain, but they are not heard. Yeah, there's no public discussion about the negative effects of this economic policy making, and if they are not heard, they might drift to the corners, yeah, to the very left, either to the very left or either to the very right, yeah. And this is something now which you can observe everywhere, yeah, in specific in Europe, but also in the United States. There's no very left-wing party, not very right-wing party, but the very left candidate of the Democrats made it, and the very right candidate of the Republicans made it. So somehow the political forces are drifting to the corners. Yeah. So we created this index. So unfortunately, Sebastian is not here today, but he compiled this index. So what we do is, when there's a new election in Europe, in an EU country, we check how many voters voted to the very right or to the very left, and we add it. So on Sunday there will be election in Sweden, and it's very clear that the very right party will gain. yeah, but maybe also the very left party gains. So we add both and check what is the share of them out of all votes. Yeah, and then we build an average for all 28 countries of the European Union. Yeah, and this is the result. Yeah, over the time horizon. So in 1994, in average, 11% were voting for extreme parties in the EU 28 countries. So this is the end of communism in Central and Eastern Europe. So less people voted for the communist parties, this came down. But since then it's going up. So now it's in average 24%. Yeah, voting either to the very right or to the very left, and you can match it now. This is the interesting issue with our index for monetary expansion. Yeah, and you might see a correlation, but you know that correlation and causation is something different. But you can discuss two directions of causations. Yeah, you can argue because the very expansionary monetary policies are reducing growth and producing a lot of losers. More people drift to the extreme. Yeah, that would be an explanation. But you could also argue because many people drift to the very extreme, the governments want to spend more in order to provide more financial means to the losers of this process. For instance, via regional redistribution schemes or support for young families or more subsidies for the pension schemes and so on. But then they don't have the financial means because the economies are not growing anymore. And then the central banks have to print the money. Yeah. And this would generate monetary expansion with a new redistribution effects, and therefore the strategy, in my view, would be certainly unsustainable. Yeah. And the interesting question is, if this goes on, yeah, and this seems to be a very robust process, yeah, what will be the trigger which is changing the situation? Yeah, and now it's 17:29, and Andy will say now time is over, and it's over. Yeah. So we could end it with Hayek. Any attempt to control prices or quantities of particular commodities deprives competition of its power of bringing about an effective coordination of individual efforts, because price changes then cease to register all relevant changes in circumstances and no longer provide a reliable guide for the individual's action. Yeah? So you change the economic system and you erode the basis for the wealth of nations. Yeah, and he wrote this sentence certainly to goods prices, but our lecture was more tilted towards interest rate as a price of capital, but the effects probably are very similar. Okay, that's it. So we had two hopefully intensive days. Yeah. I can close with saying that we were very happy that you were here. Before I continue, Andy will distribute evaluation sheets, because maybe if the evaluation is positive, we will go next round next year. But first, he distributes the